welcome to the festival and welcome to the first session in the battle for the economy strand. I'm Phil Mullan, and this morning's discussion addresses the global picture, the global economic prospects, and will be ranging across its economic, its political and its geopolitical aspects from different perspectives. I'm setting the scene by quoting one establishment viewpoint. Although the International Monetary Fund is mostly renowned for its inaccurate forecasting, indeed it's been recently dubbed by one well-known economist as the IMF standing for increasingly mediocre forecasts. However, its biannual world economic outlooks remain, I think, still useful to read because they usually capture quite well the prevailing sort of zeitgeist amongst the economic and political elites. So here's the IMF's headline summary from its latest report, which was published just a few weeks ago. To quote from it, "The global economy continues to recover slowly from the blows of the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the cost of living crisis. The global economy is limping along, and the slowdown is more pronounced in advanced economies than in emerging market and developing ones." And published as it was just a few days before the Hamas-Israeli war broke out, the IMF rightly anticipated that more geopolitical shocks could cause additional difficulties. So that's one typical headline summary viewpoint. And our panelists will be looking at what they see as the big issues and maybe the opportunities facing the global economy and how they see them unfolding. Now I'm going to introduce the panel in the order they'll be speaking, as you'll hear several times during the day. And I'm only going to give the brief profiles, and you can read their full ones, and very impressive ones, on the festival website. Okay, so we have three speakers here, as you see. We've got, first will be speaking is on my left here, Ivan Krastev. Ivan is a political analyst, permanent fellow with the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and he's also chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies. He's authored many books, including one a couple of years ago called Is It Tomorrow? Paradoxes of the Pandemic. Then second, I have next to me Liam Halligan. He is an economist, a writer, a broadcaster, also a musician, as you'll see tonight. He's well known.
I thought this was the music session.
Where's your saxophone?
I've got my tin whistle in here.
He's well known for his weekly column in the Sunday Telegraph called Economics Agenda. He also presents a daily lunchtime program on GB News called On the Money. And his latest book, which I don't think he's not talking about today, is Home Truths, the UK's Chronic Housing Shortage. So he needs to write another book, so that's not the only one he gets reference for. And third, we have Helen Searls. Helen has come over from Washington for us to give perhaps an American perspective. She's the Chief Operating Officer at Feature Story News, which is an independent international broadcast news agency. So they're each going to speak for 6 minutes. I'll be fairly tight on that, and then we'll go straight out to you all immediately for questions, for comments, and, as you probably know from the tradition of Battle of Ideas, especially for any disagreements that you have with anything you hear from the panelists. And I'll be taking comments, again, in traditional festival style, in groups of 3 or 4, which will give then the panelists opportunity to either answer one of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, or whatever. But their comebacks will be brief, and then we'll bring back more rounds from the floor. Okay, so thank you all very much. Ivan, to start.
Thank you very much for being here, but of course there is a question what I'm doing on this panel. And there are 2 reasons for this. One is always on the panel there should be somebody who is not particularly competent, which is going to make basically the conversation more interesting. And secondly, the head of the International Monetary Fund is a Bulgarian lady. So basically I can. But what I'll try to do, because global economy was not something that I have been really writing on, is that I'll try to make just 2 points. One is Adam Tooze popularized very much the idea of the polycrisis. And he said, listen, There are different crises. The interaction between them are much more important than basically the sum of the parts of this crisis. And secondly, there is no single solution. If in 1970s people believed that you're basically just going to move from capitalism to socialism or from socialism to capitalism and all the crises are going to be solved at the same time, people lost hope in this. So I was part of a research which was done in 10 of the EU member states and also United Kingdom and Switzerland, where we asked people a very simple question. Out of the 5 crises that have been basically running around in the last 15 years, which means climate, migration, economic crisis, COVID, and the war, Russia war in Ukraine, which of these you basically believe that shapes most your view on the future? So people could have a different idea of the nature of this crisis, but the story is that if this crisis is so different, there is always one that in a certain way basically shapes your view of the others. The results are going to be published in a month, so I should not basically spoil, also for my colleagues, but which do you believe is the one which has the highest percent of being the most important for the Brits? COVID.
Yeah.
COVID. You're going to see a very strange geography. COVID was very important for the Brits. Climate came as number 1 for the French. Migration for the Germans. War for the Poles. And I'm saying this because all of these crises, but also we are trying to see how people are voting based on the way they're going to define which is the most significant crisis. And you're not going to be surprised to learn that basically people who define the climate as the most important tend to vote green, and in general on the left, people who basically define migration much more on the right. What is interesting about who defined economic crisis as the most important is they always, in their biggest numbers, support the opposition, nevertheless, who is in government and who is in opposition. This is the most protest vote of all of them. Why I'm saying all this? Because in a certain way, one of the things that has changed is that while economic crisis is very much present in all of these crises, by the way, COVID has changed the way the economics function dramatically. Climate is changing on the basis of government policies and others, and the wars. It is going to be very important that when people are thinking about economy, it does not need always to think in terms basically a classical economist thinks about it. Growth, competitiveness. If you're basically totally believed that the climate is the most important thing that is happening, your view of the economy is different. If you're basically preoccupied with the idea of the war, your view of what it means for the economy to deliver is different. And my second point is about the totally, dramatically changing relations between government and business with a new kind of a geopolitical landscape. I was always asking a very simple question: which is the figures through which you can best understand how the situation has changed? And when it comes to the geopolitical dimension of it, this is the CEOs of the multinational companies. 3 years ago, they believed that they were citizens of the world. They're totally dependent on their national passports. If basically you go and you have a technology company in China, don't believe that people are not interested from which country you're coming from. What is basically the nationality of your company? And the other way around, basically, if you're Chinese in the US. I'm saying this because as a result of it also, something dramatic is happening is that while the geopolitics and economics totally changed their relationship, particularly from the high moments of globalization, one thing is very different than a kind of an old Cold War story. The country with which you are trading on are not necessarily the country which is your most important geopolitical partner. In fact, if you want to know where geopolitical loyalties go, don't look at trade. Look at with whom you are sharing data. Tell me basically with whom you're sharing data, and I'm going to tell you what is the security alliance to which you belong. But as a result of it, you're going to end up with a world in which you're going to have much more kind of important countries, middle powers that are rising, that are trading, for example, much more with China, and on the other side, they have security guarantees from the United States. And the most important for these countries is that they don't want to be forced to choose where their loyalty goes. They can have preferences in one, the other, but for them it's very important to stay there. And I'm going to end up on this because, in my view, you have this type of economic crisis, and some of them have been dramatic, Great Depression, and of course the 1970s. But there is only one difference in which I want to stress. During the Great Depression, people lost trust in the market, but they started to believe in the government. In the 1970s, a lot of people lost trust in the government, but they believed that the market can do it. We're in a situation in which, as a result of this crisis, there is a high mistrust both to the government and to the market. And in my view, this makes this crisis very different than the previous one. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Van. Excellent framework for and thought-provoking framework for the discussion. Liam.
Thank you, Phil. It's very nice to be here at the Battle of Ideas. Thank you to Claire Fox and Ella Whelan and the team for putting on such a fantastic event. And I'm only really here to play some music later on, so make sure you're all at the reception and get you dancing. Okay, so the world is at a tipping point, says Noel Quinn. He's the chief executive of HSBC, which is still the world's 7th biggest bank, because governments have allowed debts to balloon in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, and then, as Ivan says, the global COVID pandemic. And that poses what Quinn calls a global reckoning. I'm concerned about a tipping point on fiscal deficits, he said earlier this week. When it comes, it will come fast, and there are a number of economies in the world where it will hit hard. So this session is called Rising Tensions, Falling Growth. It could really be called Falling Growth, Rising Tensions, because growth was falling before we had the sort of latest outbreak of geopolitical angst and deterioration, which it strikes me is unfortunately going to get a lot worse before it gets better. If you look at that IMF World Economic Outlook, I find the IMF's a lot better at forecasting global growth rather than growth of individual countries, particularly of the UK. It seems to have a downer on the UK. I speak as somebody who used to work at the IMF. Those IMF numbers show that last year, the global economy grew at 3.5%. This year, it's on course to grow at 3%. Next year, it's on course to grow at 2.9%. What does that mean? Well, on average, between 2000 and 2019, before COVID, the global economy grew at 3.8%, and that included the global financial crisis for 3 or 4 years. So we're well below par, and now we've got all this geopolitical angst on top of that. The US is growing okay, 2.1% this year, 2.5% next year. The Eurozone isn't, 0.7% this year, 1.2% next year. I agree with Noel Quinn. We are taking on enormous liabilities. In the year 2000, the UK's national debt was 30% of GDP. It's now 100% of GDP, with a huge amount of methodological shenanigans going on to keep the figure low, not including public sector pension liabilities, not including private finance initiative liabilities, which are almost as big as the national debt itself. The US is taking on a lot of debt, particularly under Joe Biden, but then again, the US has got the world's reserve currency, as de Gaulle said. The rest of the world pays the interest on the US's debt, that exorbitant privilege. And what we're seeing, because debts are high and interest rates are high, governments, particularly Western governments, are paying huge amounts of debt service. The UK, according to Fitch, the ratings agency, they seem to be better at doing our sums than the OBR, maybe because they're in the private sector and they get sacked if they get it really wrong, by the way. According to Fitch, the UK, I mean, this is absolutely astonishing statistic, is going to spend £110 billion this year on debt interest, on government debt. That's second only to the NHS. We spend more on debt interest than we do on schools, on the whole of education, than we do on defence. It's completely immoral. It's disgusting. It's 10% of all government revenue is going on debt service. Imagine if, you ran your personal finances like that. People will call you an idiot, and yet we're running one of the world's most sophisticated, one of the most financially astute countries in the world like that. And that means as central bank interest rates go up, of course, bond yields go up. You may not care about the bond market. It really cares about you, let me tell you. And so government borrowing costs in the UK at a 30-year high, government borrowing costs in the US, the highest since just before the global financial crisis, government borrowing costs in Italy very high. I'll quickly come on to that. So we've already got falling growth, and now we've got rising tensions. This has been clear since the summer, because since the summer, ladies and gentlemen, the price of oil has gone from $70 to over $90 a barrel, even before Israel-Hamas happened in the way it has. And the oil price then went up 35%, even though global growth was slowing because of higher interest rates, because of OPEC, because of the exporters cartel. It is back big time, playing geopolitics. And it's working in conjunction very coherently with Russia, a country I know well, a country where I lived for quite a long time and where I was a foreign correspondent. And OPEC Plus is really squeezing global oil supply. And then on top of that, you've got the possibility of conflagration in the Middle East. And I keep reading in my Financial Times and my economists that, oh, don't worry, mate, we're less oil dependent now. It's all fine. We're less oil intensive. And it's true. Less of our GDP depends on oil because we've got a service sector. But you try having a service sector when you can't turn on the lights or you can't get to work. And if we're so much less oil dependent than we were in '73, the Yom Kippur War, the first oil price shock when the price of oil quadrupled, if we're so much less oil dependent, ladies and gentlemen, how is it that in 1973 the world used 50 million barrels of oil a day, but now we use 101 million barrels of oil a day? That doesn't sound less dependent to me. I'd like to point out two more things. The first is that while I talk and write about oil a lot, I actually think the new oil, the new key input for growth is semiconductors. And semiconductor manufacturing is now a major part of the great game. China's interested in Taiwan for many reasons, because it produces half the semiconductors in the world. The Russians are now stopping exports of neon, a crucial noble gas used in semiconductor manufacturing. The Japanese are limiting exports of pure hydrogen fluoride used in semiconductor manufacturing. This is an absolutely huge market, absolutely vital for Western growth. And finally, Phil, rare earths, also part of the great game. China has 44 million tons of rare earth ore that we know of. Brazil, Russia, and Vietnam have 20 million tons plus. Australia, the great Western hope, has 4.2 million tons. And the US have 2.3 million tons. And it's not just that China has the bulk of the reserves. China has 70% of the production output of rare earths in usable form in the world. And it has 85% of the production capacity of rare earths. Do we really want to go down this EV route? Do we really want to bet the whole ranch on electric vehicles when they depend on rare earths? We're a lot more rare earth dependent than we are oil dependent, and we are oil dependent. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liam. Lots of interest there as well. One particular point Liam made, which I think is worth thinking about, is he said he could reverse the title, and that actually the slowing growth, the declining growth, precedes all these shocks, both pandemic shocks, geopolitical crises and stuff over the last 3 years. So I think that's a very important framework as well for us to think about when you're looking at what's happening today, but the longer term trends. Helen.
Thanks, Phil. I thought I'd spend my time just in introduction, just looking in a fairly focused way at the US economy, because the US economy seems to be a little bit different in terms of some of the growth trends. Figures this week announced that far from growth slowing down, growth in the US expanded to 4.9% in the third quarter. The US economy is different and it matters. It's the largest economy in the world. It accounts for about a quarter of the world's gross domestic product, about a fifth of the world's foreign direct investment. It's the most important export destination for a fifth of the world's countries. And the US dollar, as others have mentioned, is absolutely crucial in trade and financial transactions and plays a unique role in the world. So it looks as though something different is happening at the moment in the US. It looks as though the US is powering ahead. But I think that when you take a closer look at the numbers, there are some real problems, because despite the good numbers that get thrown up, there is no real brilliant good faith in the American economy at the moment. I think it's really evident when you look at reporting. Every time a figure comes out, economists and journalists are always very surprised that the figure is better than they thought. So when jobs figures gets announced, inflation gets announced, growth, it's often a bit higher than people like the IMF are predicting, and everybody's very surprised. And I think that is because people have a very low expectations of what can come from the economy. The IMF sees the US economy as has the most rosy outlook for the advanced economies. But for next year, it's only predicting growth of about 1.5% in its latest report. So there's no confidence in the US economy in the long term. And I think that's because the growth that we're seeing in the US is short-lived, based on short-lived factors. It's based on often the weakness and the defensiveness of the political outlook in America at the moment, and many of the things that are happening actively make things worse. For example, if you look at the recent growth figures, 4% of growth in the last quarter was put down to growth in consumer spending. And that growth in consumer spending is not a result of huge increases in disposable incomes, although there has been some change in that. It's much more a kind of post-pandemic legacy. You can see that the US weathered the pandemic a bit differently than Europe. We didn't go through the energy crisis that happened here. People saved money during the pandemic. Student loans were put on hold, a lot of government stimulus checks, which means that people actually came out of the pandemic with quite a lot of money in their pockets, and they wanted to spend it. And consumer spending on things like travel and experiences, going out to eat, alcohol with the pandemic poor, which we've all come to know and love, and fees and entrance fees on things like Taylor Swift concerts or going to see Messi play football. These things have all gone up massively, but it's all a big party, as we all kind of think you only live once after the pandemic. And I think that's one kind of the factor of growth, and very much a one-off thing, given what real levels of incomes are. Another example of a growth factor of something that looks good on paper is investment. Investment in the US is going up. It's nearly reached its kind of trajectory that it would have been, supposedly, had the pandemic not happened. But the investment that is taking place in the US, it's a lot, it's grown, but it's very much governed by the idea of bringing things home and making things safe. There is a sort of defensiveness and a risk aversion to investment in the US. It's not based upon a dynamic economy, it's based upon the idea of bringing things into a safer environment. So reshoring, that is the bringing of investments back from China and Asia back onto US soil, has been huge in the last 2 years and expanding. Something like 364,000 jobs were reshored in the US in 2022. Huge numbers. And when you look at what jobs are being reshored, they are things where people really experience the risk, things like EV batteries, computer components, chemicals, rare earth chemicals, all of those things are the things that the US manufacturers are basically saying they don't trust the world economy, they're reshoring them. But reshoring doesn't really improve the competitiveness of the US industry. It doesn't improve the US cost structures. Rather, it's being encouraged, and this has become more evident more recently, by a huge amount of amount of government spending and a kind of a political outlook which is encouraging the investment at home. So what you now see is that the US has, I mean, people are putting it like it's rediscovered an industrial policy. It's rediscovered the idea that the government can work to help industry. And many factors might be fueling it, whether it's fear of recession, fear of supply chain shocks, fear of AI. But but in the context of the post-pandemic world, it certainly now is the case that in America, there is a sense that government should do more. And government should bring things home to America. It's almost like we've all become MAGA politicians now. We all are made in America and proud, whether we're Republican or not. So the subsidies that exist are not just, the pandemic subsidies, which we are familiar with, but the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act are all Biden's pet projects to really assist industry and have an industrial policy accordingly. I think what this does is it provides momentum to the US economy, but it doesn't provide any kind of transformation. We've talked about how the US lives on easy money, and it is easy, and it's getting easier. I mean, every time there is a global shock, the US dollar goes up, and more money gets poured into the American economy, and the American debt can just get bigger and bigger. But what is the net effect of this when it doesn't really change productivity or competitiveness? I would say it makes the US more resilient, but just as slow. And less connected to the real world as everything gets focused back on America. And I think that poses a real problem, which makes things worse because it exacerbates global tensions, and it's something we can look at in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Helen. I think that's, particularly given we're in Britain, it's very useful to have an American perspective on the story. And just to remind you, I'll shut up, but just to remind you that the next session is on the British economy. So that doesn't mean don't talk about anything to do with Britain, but it does mean we are trying in this session to set the global picture more. And so those points about America's leadership, the strength of American economy, clearly that has both economic and geopolitical implications, so that might be a place you might want to focus on more than on what's going on within Britain. Anyway, floor is yours. I'll take, say, 3 or 4.
This question is for Mr. Krastev. After your book in 2017, After Europe, and since then we've had COVID, we've had Ukraine, and we've had now Hamas-Israel. Is the EU relevant anymore?
Yeah, good morning. My question's probably primarily for Helen because it's about the US economy, but other people could answer too. I very much agreed with your assessment on the 4.9% initial data on the US economy, and we should of course take note that that came after 2.1% in the second quarter. So although it is a pickup, we know there has been longer term historical difficulties with growth in the US. My question is particularly related to the US Department of Commerce said that a very big factor was not only consumer spending, but also federal government spending and local and state government spending. And particularly regarding the Inflation Reduction Act, my question is to what extent do you think that's already having a significant and transformative effect on the US economy, particularly things like the vehicle sector, where I know some of the major companies are already, for example, prioritizing EV, electric vehicle production, and there are some quite important shifts going on there. So the key question is really to what extent do you think that the state, both at a local and a federal level, is playing a major role in fueling the economy at the moment?
Yeah, no, this is, I think this is for Liam. We learned, there was reported in the front page of the Financial Times on Thursday, we found out that the opposition leader, Rachel Reeves, is a serial plagiarist, but we already should have known that because she plagiarized her economic program from Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act, rebranded like Securenomics for the UK context. Except we found out last autumn, perhaps, that the UK doesn't have the exorbitant privilege that the US does. So a serious question will be, do you think that if this program is that there's an attempt to replicate it in the UK, will this be a total disaster? Will the borrowing costs go through the roof, and will it be put an end to very shortly or forcibly scaled back?
Yeah, that's the it kind of picks up on actually on the point you raised at the end, sort of, Phil, about the kind of the sense of American power and kind of is it back? I spent years going to these sessions and it was all about the rise of China and how the decline of America. And America has never seemed more imperially mighty than it has over the last couple of years. And there's obviously the decline of, or at least a blip in China's development that seems to be affecting the economy. But I'm also mindful of the fact that we saw quite a lot of movement away from the global south in the wake of the Ukraine war and the sanctions and the movement from the financial system. So I'm just wondering if you can give me a little bit of light of, does America seem so mighty because China is perhaps in problems, or are there kind of real signs that some sense of order is kind of, the traditional order has been done, or is this all just the calm before the real storm?
Great package of questions, so particularly on the, well, always that couple dealing with the theme of America, to what extent it has regained itself, is the industrial policies and stuff really working, and what does this mean for America as playing the role as the, I suppose, global policeman and as the authority in the world as well. So who would like to come back? And also we got the European question as well, so I think those two.
And the British question.
And there's a British question, which I'm sure those will come back on as well. But yeah, I'll come out now.
I just want to say a little bit about the States, not to steal Helen's thunder, of course. She speaks good English for an American, huh? Sorry, how to insult two massive races at the So, yeah, the US is growing remarkably well at the moment. I think that's worth saying. But the truth is that for the last 20, maybe the last 25 years, it's been China that's been the world's global growth locomotive. Not because it's a bigger economy, because it still isn't. It is on a purchasing power parity basis, but not on a nominal basis. But for the last 25, 30 years, when China's been doing 7, 8, 9, 10%, and America's been doing 1, 2, 3%, China has contributed a lot more to global growth. And it still is, by the way, because it's still growing a lot faster than the States. China, on its uppers, just grew also in the third quarter by 4.9%, to the extent that we can believe the numbers. And a lot of people are comparing China to Japan in the early 90s, because they think, oh, it was the second largest economy and now China is, and they made cars and now China does, and aren't I clever? But they're not the same at all, because China is still very much a middle-income country by GDP per head. It's got loads of room to grow. China has high interest rates compared to Japan in the early 90s. They've got a lot of room to cut. And Japan hasn't done 4.9% in my lifetime. China's doing 4.9%, when everyone's writing it off and saying, I read moronic, research notes from investors in Greenwich, Connecticut saying, China, 100 times worse than Lehman. No ways. Look at the leverage ratios on Chinese property. Yeah, a lot of Chinese property has been pumped up with local government debt, and 70% of household wealth in China is in real estate, and real estate is 30% of GDP. We should all be really interested in Chinese real estate, even though it's very hard to invest in. But unlike Lehman, where you had endless people investing with 5% deposits, even zero, even negative deposits, in China for years you've needed 30 to 40%, 80% if you're an investor. So the property market in China, much derided in everything you read in the Western world, is a lot less brittle. It's a lot less levered than pre-Lehman America was. I've got a lot to say on the UK. I've got a lot to say on the US, but we can come back to that.
Great, thanks for that. And Rado, actually, one of the speakers who dropped out, was going to focus on the China question, so I'm really glad that Liam has thrown that into the picture as well and challenged some of the conventional views about where China is.
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of following on from that I think the whole point that we need to recognise is, whereas I think China did and probably still does, once it gets over the Everglade, all the housing crisis that's happening there, has the potential to pull the rest of the world with it. I think what's happening in America doesn't have that potential. I think it's a very it's become much more introspective. It's become much more, there's tariff barriers, there's subsidies for American consumers. It's all very American-based, and in fact is not going to have that great impact on the rest of the world, even if there is growth there. And I think that's an important factor. In terms of federal spending, yeah, there is an increase in federal spending, but one of the things I thought was very interesting about the report that came out just this week is a lot of it is on weapons, in terms of having to replenish weapons supplies because of what's happened in Ukraine. There's also a lot of spending on because of inflation, Medicare and Social Security payments have gone up because they do rise, probably not quite as much as they should, but with inflation. And so those bills have got much, much bigger. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting about the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know there's another session on that, so I don't want to kind of talk about that too much, but if you look at the way the money has been given out, whether it's subsidies for people to buy electric vehicles, it still isn't quite having the impact because people are not buying the electric vehicles in the numbers that that was anticipated. And I think that's something quite interesting to look at, whether that Inflation Reduction Act is going to have quite the impact that everybody thinks. A lot of money, though, is sloshing around the American economy in terms of subsidies, all sorts of things. So I think that, it will have an impact, but maybe not the transformative impact that other people think are mentioning.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Listen, where you're totally right is that European Union is uniquely vulnerable to this situation.
Exactly.
For many reasons. What is interesting is that the fact that you're becoming less relevant and much more vulnerable does not mean that basically you're losing support, because all of these small and medium-sized states do not have a scale to react to any of this, probably with the exception of Germany and France. But the world has changed so much on the level of scale that, for example, we're talking industrial policy. Can Bulgaria have an industrial policy? So from this point of view, in a certain way, the sources of support for the European Union is not success anymore, but the weakness when you try to compare. And this has, in my view, something to do also with the Chinese-America story, because in the 1970s, there was a famous phrase, competitive decadence. It is not who is doing better. The problem is that you hope that the others are going to do worse. And from this point of view, I do believe this is where basically people start go. But there were three things about Europe that are critically important. The war in Ukraine basically questioned the three major assumptions on which European security was based. First, that a major war is not possible in Europe anymore. Not military conflicts, a major war. And what people, for me, scale is something that we're really starting to missing. The number of shells that now on both sides have been fired in Ukraine is on the level of 1942. This is a major war. This is not basically Kosovo fighting Serbia. This is something totally different. And if you see how this is changing the economies, particularly the Russian economy and so on, you have a major structural change. The second thing is European countries managed to convince themselves that military power doesn't matter. This was after Iraq. You look around and said, okay, Americans were so powerful, so what they did, what they achieved. And suddenly you understand that military power doesn't matter when you don't have it. In a certain way, when the war started, Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks, Germany for 2 days. And thirdly, what is very important, and in my view this is critically important, is in order to go and to change your security perspective, this is not a budget change. This is a cultural change. In Germany, military officers, when they go to their units, they go dressed in civilian uniforms. Civilian dresses, because people don't like military uniforms on the street. This is not going to be changed with a budget change. You can invest as much as you want in the military budget. So from this point of view, many of these crises came as a cultural crisis. But also, and this is my last point, what is important to understand the dynamics, why you have all these crises, you have this irrelevance, but on the other side, basically, you don't have the feeling that European Union is kind of a much more closer, basically, to disintegrate than before, is based on a very simple fact. All these crises divide Europe very differently. For example, migration divided East-West big way in 2015. And then comes the war in Ukraine, and basically a country like Poland, that was totally anti-migration, got 1 million of people. there was a moment in which 8% of the Polish households have been hosting Ukrainians. This is big. This is big. You have the COVID, and then suddenly countries like Austria realize how much they're dependent, their markets, on people who are crossing on a daily basis the borders. Huge. And of course now, interestingly enough, when you see these different divisions, by the way, climate is very much generational, particularly in Europe. The sensitivity is different between different generations. So suddenly you can say that this is slightly when somebody is very much drunken. It's very important that you're basically not tilting in one direction. And the different divisions of a different crisis is what is keeping a balance. It's not a balance based on strengths, it's balance based on weakness. But in this world that is coming, European Union is really much more pressed than others. And the really very last point, in every crisis when it comes, people are going to say, we are now going to see who is stronger. For example, democracy is authoritarianism. And at the end of the crisis, you don't know the answer. Do you remember the first 1 year where everybody was saying how incredible the Chinese are? They managed to close everything, to lock down everything. Basically, nobody's getting out. And then 2 years later, you said, are they crazy not to open? So from this point of view, none of the crisis produces the idea of a winner. That you say, this works, this does not work. All the time you have the feeling that nothing works. And people basically get scared because before the crisis, they were told by the governments, there is no money. And then comes COVID. And then comes war, and government said, money are not the problem. And if you're a citizen, you cannot orient yourself anymore.
Great. Yes, it's the great unraveling of the world you're describing there. Where's the microphone?
Thanks. I agreed with what Liam said about government debt, but I was surprised people didn't really talk about corporate debt too much. Because I do worry that with falling growth and rising interest rates, lots of businesses are going to be really struggling. And you put that together with the fact that people have stopped financing through equity and started financing almost entirely through debt. The risk now lies not with the kind of capitalist class, as we might call it, but with governments, pension funds, the states, the regional states in the US. And lots of these businesses are businesses like utility, energy, infrastructure, that have a real impact on people's real lives. And it feels to me that the real tensions could come when some of those start really falling over. So I just wanted to know how we kind of navigate that when it does feel to me that the kind of typical owners of capital are kind of shielded from that in a way because it's all in the debt.
Taking a step back, is what we're seeing over the last 8 years sort of the supremacy of politics over economics, in that Deng Xiaoping began the reforms in China, not so China could get rich and import luxury Western goods, but so it could be powerful after 140 years of humiliation. And the same with Vladimir Putin. He's not concerned about oligarchs. He was thinking of his place in history. He wanted to be another Peter the Great, to secure Ukraine for Russia forever. So what we're seeing is history's biting back and politics is taking precedence over economics, and we're seeing the consequences.
Thanks.
2 quick points. The first one is about the impact of opinion makers, ones on IQ, on the economy itself, and another the doom and gloom that lots of journalists bring into the equation is partly fueling the doom and gloom in the economy. And the second one, we haven't really heard any mention of huge technological innovations and their impact on the economy as well, particularly AI, and huge progress in the medical innovation, which has been talked over the last few years. It'll be good to hear your views about that as well.
Thanks. I've got a question about China, just to continue that discussion. Slightly selfishly, because I'm talking about net zero tomorrow. One of the points that's often made about net zero is that what's the point, because what we're doing is we're actually offshoring emissions. So we're going to clamp down on cutting carbon emissions, but actually what's going to happen is the goods are going to get made in China instead, and therefore the emissions are still going to happen. They're just going to happen somewhere else. So is that still a trend? Are we seeing both reshoring and offshoring at the same time? And also, what is the role of China in the world economy? Because obviously those growth rates look very, very impressive. Well, are they really driving the world economy along, or are they like a growth vampire that's, if you like, activity that would have taken place in developed economies is now being shifted to China, and therefore actually it's a zero-sum game where that's, we're just moving it to cheaper destinations, not just China actually, but places like Vietnam as well. But actually, in terms of the global picture, things aren't any more dynamic. So I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Great, thank you. So problems of astronomic corporate debt, mainly in the West. Got a question about the relationship of politics to economics, and have we seen a turnaround in terms of a new era? And here, to what extent are opinion makers, which you've all been elevated to, all the gloom and doom that comes out of the media, does that actually generate problems within the economy? Everyone's too downbeat about everything. And also a question which is in many people's articles about AI and new technology. Doesn't that transform things when we're looking at the economic possibilities? And then more on China. Okay, so whichever you want to pick up on those.
I'll try to address the question about the primacy of the politics, and it's obvious. It has changed. But in a certain way, it is changing differently in different places. And one of the new things is that it might be one of the things that we are least talking about as the effect of the COVID is kind of the burst of apocalyptic imagination. Suddenly you realize that everything can change dramatically and kind of change big. Between 2018 and 2021, 70% of the Russian population believed that the World War III is going to start in the next 10 years. And World War III, this is a nuclear, it's big, it's not the war with Ukraine. So from this point of view, one of the effects of all this crisis was this totally squeezing of the idea of time. And this is not simply that politics is up, but it is a politics, put it kind of metaphorically, of the last man. You all the time have a huge idea of a time deficit. For example, if you look at the decision of President Putin to do what he did, there are three things that are critically important from his point of view. One is, we always talk about the effect of the regime. But the most important about the regime is that you have a leader who does not trust his successor. Nevertheless, that he's going to appoint him. Because he had a successor for a while. And as a result of it, you want to finish the most important job in your lifetime. And this is the problem of timing. And this goes everywhere. And basically this goes with the American politics, it goes with the Chinese politics. Secondly, the thing that we didn't talk is demography. You have basically, in many of these places, be it Russia, be it China, a really loss of population. And this idea that there is not enough people in the world on your side is critically important. One of the major reasons why the Ukrainians should be Russians is because there are not enough Russians in the world. In 3 months before the war started, President Putin on 3 different occasions, without being asked, repeated one and the same phrase. He said, a very famous Russian 19th century scholar, Mendeleev, predicted that in year 2000 there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. And there are now 150. So from this point of view, but listen, this is the way many of European society starts to think. This is the way very much the Chinese are starting to think. And I do believe this kind of idea of a demography and also the story that you have a younger generation that is a very small cohort is also defining how the politics looks like. So it is not simply that politics has a primacy over economy, but it's a very specific type of politics.
Great. Helen.
I was just going to mention a little bit on the last bit, because I meant to say something about Europe, which I think that, and then I can go on to talk a bit about China. I think one of the things that is really noticeable in the current sort of fragmentation of the world economy is just how much Europe is just becomes much less relevant. Because if you kind of think about it, the the US-China tensions which are forcing both of them to look inwards on themselves. At least those economies and those countries have the possibility of building something at home. And you look at, say, something like the tech sector, where the US has a strong tech sector, China has a potential rival tech sector. Those two things can develop. But Europe, doesn't really have a tech sector. And what Europe ends up doing is just kind of regulating the tech sector for everybody else. And you can see that Europe kind of then plays the role that it's always played, because it's been part of a big world economy, becomes much more kind of squeezed out. And I think the level of fragmentation is, or the kind of the divisions within the world really cannot be overstated. One of the things that I've done a lot over the last 10 years is go to China for business reasons. And the last time I went, which was this year, I used to go and, you stay in these lovely hotels and they're full of Western businessmen and lots of Brits who are trying to make money in China and everything. The last time I went, there was no other Westerner in the hotel. It was just myself and my boss, and everybody else was Chinese. And, we do business in China, my company does, and we have been warned that we would be much better off if we were not an American company. They would really like they want us to kind of transform into something else. It's like, okay. But I think that sort of division is really stark now. And it is and on the discussion, I think it is entirely political. It is absolutely a political decision that has been made on both parts, that's very strongly felt, that you do have to kind of look to your own, look at home, put up the walls and just put your head down and get through it. And I think that's going to have a profound impact on everywhere else, because of the difficulties. Because of the difficulties of just being able to take part in an economy where you're just completely excluded from it.
Gosh, so many amazing questions in the air. I still want to get back to the UK. I want to get back to Europe. The lady who mentioned AI, I wanted to talk briefly about AI in the context of semiconductors, because if you look at Bain, they're saying that the global semiconductor market's going to go from 600 billion last year to $1.5 trillion by 2030. If AI really gets going, it's going to be a lot bigger than that. And the extent to which the facilitating inputs of semiconductor manufacturing become part of the great game will just intensify. So it's a whole panel session in itself, but I'll just put that point out there. Drawing together the threads of Ivan's excellent demography comment, and what you were saying, Helen, too, about growth beyond the West. Look at the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a lot harder to do that on television, by the way. If you get the CPTPP area, the 11 countries, and you add the UK, they are currently 16% of global GDP. If you get the EU, it's 16% of global GDP, the EU 27. Spool forward to 2050. CPTPP plus the UK goes from 16 to 24% of global GDP. The EU 27 goes from 16 to 10% of GDP. That is almost entirely a demographic story and where the growth is. So you can read in lots of newspapers that the CPTPP is a joke, and snarly working from home civil servants can come up with absolute bullshit estimates of future growth prospects of the area, completely economically illiterate. But this is where the growth is, and it's really, really important that all of us in Europe, whether we're on this windy island or continental Europe, which of course does have many world-class companies, we've got to get beyond ourselves, and we've got to get out there and trade more with the world. Just briefly on some other things, corporate debt, a great point, but it's government debt that's growing fastest, and it's government debt where the bond vigilantes are really focused at the moment. And it's the QE unwind that people who really understand bond markets are focused on. And the insanity that central banks now are doing QT, quantitative tightening, selling bonds back to the market, just when Western governments, post-lockdown, are selling loads of bonds to the market as well. I mean, if you want me to talk about that more afterwards, I can endlessly, but and on economic journalism and politics, look, economics always wins. Politics is chat and parlour games. It's always a response in the end to economics. Almost all wars are about territory and resources and economics. It really is the economy stupid. You're not stupid. I'm just quoting James Carville. If you don't know who he is, look it up. And I'm constantly astonished at how little journalists know about economics and financial markets. It's deeply frustrating for someone like me. I've been a political journalist. I've been a lobby correspondent. I used to be political correspondent at the Financial Times. But I'm basically an economist. The lack of economic understanding among the Fourth Estate, the constant confusion between levels and rates of change, the willful disinterest shown in economics and commerce and trade and business, as if it's grubby and it's nicer and more fun to talk about the dramas of who's up, who's down in that building over there. And finally, on net zero, I do think things are changing, not because I'm a climate skeptic, because I'm not. I want a cleaner planet for my kids and one day maybe my grandkids. But we have to have a proper conversation about where the costs of net zero fall and how quickly we start paying them. It is insane, of course, to focus on EV and rare earths without understanding the massive emissions that are involved in the production of those rare earths, the chemicals that are used, the massive carbon intensity of rare earth production, the madness of not using North Sea oil, but relying instead on LNG shipped from America. Do you know how much carbon you use when you gasify and regasify LNG? Do you know how much you use when you put a load of LNG in a tanker and transport it 3,000 miles in a diesel-powered freight ship? It's just madness. And so I do think we need to use North Sea oil, because even the Climate Change Commission, which is vastly Panglossian about how quickly renewable energy will come on stream and the efficiency gains we're going to get from wind turbines, even though the efficiency gains are going backwards, even they say by 2050 we'll still be using oil and gas for 25% of our energy needs. The current figure, ladies and gentlemen, when you include electricity generation and transport, the current figure of oil and gas usage here in the UK is 70% of our energy needs.
A group of people this side now.
I want to paint a slightly different picture. We've been in an economic crisis since the 1970s, and things have improved quite a bit since the 1970s. We've got economic growth at 3%. That means in the next 25 years, GDP will double. We've got a rebalancing of the economies where there's domestic investment, because it was way too one-sided. We've got a cutting out, high interest rates means some companies go to the wall, which will lower productivity reduce. So you can paint a sort of different picture of how to understand the economy in the next 20 or 30 years at least. And so we might be worried about these deficits, but the sort of management of these deficits has been a very long running trend. The thing on the horizon that I think that some of the panel have highlighted that is, I think, an issue is the sort of fiction of zero carbon production. And this will hit not actually through rare earth metals, because they're not actually quite so rare and you can open new points of production. But as I understand it, things like copper manufacturing, things like that, the idea of producing masses of machinery to convert sunlight and wind into energy. Already we've got wind power being much more expensive than it used to be. So I think we can take it with a pinch of salt, these looming crises to an extent, and be aware of them. But I think we can paint quite a different picture, as that it's the politics where there would become a crisis that would disrupt the economics, as far as I can see.
Okay, interesting take on it.
Quick question about how you see the speed of different countries charging towards net zero, and how that's going to affect the global picture. And if you could touch on that, I think that would be good. Okay. Directed mainly at Liam.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on this question of politics. the trend over the last 2 or 3 decades of globalization, I think, has carried with it an offshoring of political decision-making to supranational bodies, and also a tendency towards executive power. So, post-Maastricht in Europe, we've seen decisions being made in Brussels and so on. Politicians more willing to get onto planes to Davos. So I think this groupthink that's coming from supranational bodies is a problem, because I think it's led to paucity of debate, particularly on things like energy. You look at COP, you also look at COVID. These were global, mostly global responses. Anybody steps out of line, like Sweden, or even a Liz Truss perhaps, and this is why you have the fourth estate is just also, I think, tracking the views of these supranational bodies.
Okay.
Oh, hello there. My question is about whether the increased financialisation of the markets since the end of the Bretton Woods system has stifled innovation. So what I mean by that is if you're having currency trading or companies being reliant on their stock prices, etc. It means that anything that's slightly risky or innovative, which all breaks from the dogma, has a hard financial cost for doing that. So as a result, it results in people not taking any risks or doing anything differently, just doing sort of the same old, we'll rely on technology, maybe have a little bit better productivity methodology, and that results in that kind of managerialist mindset for growth.
Thanks very much. Just an observation first on American growth. Growth of a couple of % doesn't particularly impress me when you've got a fiscal deficit the size they've got. So that observation gets onto my question, really. Don't you think that we should take more seriously the sources of growth and the sustainability of GDP growth instead of just talking about growth rates? Very, very common for journalists and others to talk about GDP growth as if it's all on a par, as if every type of GDP growth is on a par. Give you an example, the GFC. I read countless articles saying if UK growth had continued, well, it didn't, because it was laid and it was pregnant with debt and it was going to go bust. It was based on that. So we need to have better discourse on GDP growth, I think.
Why do you keep on going about growth and GDP? It's meaningless. Any muppet of a chancellor can engineer growth. It's easy. You just get another 1 million people into the country, growth goes up. You just borrow 100 billion, hundreds of billions, pump it into the economy, growth goes up. It's easy. But what's the point of growth going up of the country, of GDP per person going down? All that means is that everyone's getting poorer. The only reason you want growth is because you think growth means more taxes, which means you can pay off the deficit, which means you can reduce the debt. And if the growth doesn't lead to more taxes, then what you're talking about is meaningless.
Yeah, when I'm kind of having a bit of a depressive day, I think about all of the particularly pre-modern trends that seem to characterize our lives. And one of them in the global economy seems that perhaps in reality, but more importantly at the level of thinking and ideology, is that the global economy feels much more zero-sum than it used to. The promise of capitalism being that growth would always kind of be win-win for everyone, and everything feels zero-sum. The obvious example is US-China competition, but also the way that we're sold net zero almost now on the kind of explicit understanding that we'll all be poorer and probably colder at the same time. And then we think about in Europe, especially with regards to the war in Ukraine, that even the politicians there are like, oh, we're all going to have to tighten our belts in order to support the Ukrainians. And previously wars, at least in the kind of 20th century or after, they weren't necessarily sold like that. And so I wonder are we entering a era of more zero-sum? The counterexample is Biden saying, no, we're rich enough, we can have war in Israel, war in Ukraine, you got any more wars, we'll fund them all. But that is a kind of peculiarly American self-image. I'm wondering, are we entering a more zero-sum global economy?
With regards to debt, for governments, do you think the introduction of CBDCs is a way of them being able to control the debt better and get out the problem they've created? And do you think that's why they kind of some governments are at war with cryptocurrencies, because it's them losing control of the financial system?
Okay, we'll pause there, and I'll try and get all the rest of you in the next round. So if our panel can come up, not on everything, because there's so many good stuff there, but certainly the first one on the, are things as gloomy as we're portraying them?
Can I do three?
Of course you can. Start first.
Okay, the gentleman here. I completely agree with you on the groupthink of the fourth estate. It's just a lack of curiosity, and it's getting worse because most national journalists now, they don't come up through regional press. They don't learn to be reporters first. You say stuff, I write it in the paper. I find someone who disagrees with you, they say stuff, you report. Journalism has become the sort of, lifestyle hobby of the listless children of the 1%. It isn't something that it used to be, where somebody could come from a sort of, first generation home ownership household, a blue collar household, and with guile, the sort of people who are top of the class, but also, socially popular, they would become the journalists. And, you look at some of the figures in journalism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, some of the people who initially hired me, but people coming into journalism now, they think it's their mission in life to be activists rather than to just report. I guess I'm some kind of English-Irish hybrid with 24 American-born first cousins and a Protestant mother and a Catholic father. It explains my personality. But if I hear somebody make an argument and they're all making the argument, I go out of my way just to argue the other way, because I think that's my job as a journalist, and it doesn't lead to success in conventional terms, but I think it's important that people do that. So you're absolutely right. The groupthink of journalism, the absolute imbibing of what Mark Carney says as the way, the truth, and the light on everything always is just insane. And that allies with the lack of interest and the lack of numeracy of journalists as well. And I think that's why, podcasting has got so popular, because there are so many clever people in this room, and there are so many clever people in this country, even though most journalists assume you're all thick. And you want nourishment, you want intellectual debate. That's why podcasting is doing so well, and long may that continue. And one, I'll just pick up the one on zero-sum game. So the difference between a zero-sum world, where we're two cavemen in a cave, right? And there's one steak. And the zero-sum world is I eat the steak and I kill you, right? The world of trade is that we go out and we find a mating pair of buffaloes, and then we've got lots of steak. And the difference between a zero-sum world, because human nature is zero-sum, to get to an enlightened free trade world, it's the battle between, and Keynes wrote a lot about this in Essays in Persuasion, it's the battle between ideas and vested interests. And my vested interest is to fight you and kill you and eat the steak. But if we talk about ideas, we say, hold on, we'll share the steak, and then we'll go and do our buffalo breeding scheme. And the difference between a zero-sum world and a gains from trade world, it's the crucial ingredient you need is intellectual and political leadership to sell a vision of cooperation. And our political media class is so woefully bad at the moment that isn't happening. And that's why we are moving ever increasingly to a zero-sum world with more protectionism, more wars, more moronic, identity-driven debates, more cancelling of people with different but very valid and very widely held ideas. So we all need to pray for better journalists and better politicians.
Hear, hear. Helen.
Well, I employ a lot of journalists, and a lot of them can't balance their checkbook, so they're certainly not necessarily the most financially literate people. But I really actually think that isn't the problem in terms of economic discussion and economic debate, because if you look at, and I'm doing a session about journalism tomorrow, so I'm on a panel talking about that, so we can talk about it then. But I think what's really going on at the moment is that there actually is no political debate about the economy, and the fact that it isn't journalists' fault it's actually that there is no alternative, and the way that things get discussed is as though there's only one way of doing things. I mean, in the US at the moment, the only way that debt gets discussed is this rather peculiar thing that we go through every so often to raise the debt ceiling. And that is a discussion where, you know, Congress has to pass a continuing resolution usually so that the debt ceiling can be raised. But that debate is really vacuous because there is really nobody now on the political spectrum in America who are talking about anything other than spend, 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 spend. And I think that is the issue. And so I also disagree with some of the points that have been made that, you know, I know James Carville said it and it was a great phrase and it mattered for Clinton that it was the economy stupid. But I now think that there is a lot of politics determining what is happening, and it always is. But I think it's particularly a focus at the moment that a lot of things that are happening are very much political, because what could drive innovation and what could shake things up is if we were to use the current stagnation to, you know, allow there to be a good crisis and reorganization of investment. But what happens is that politically, that's not acceptable. And so industries are propped up, there's subsidies, there's all of this kind of stuff. And I think politics gets in the way of really just letting innovation take its course. So I think right now, maybe it isn't the economy stupid, maybe it's politics.
Listen, both can be stupid. And I want to make just 2 points. One is your very important story about the win-win game. The problem is that today, if you're going to tell somebody that something is a win-win, he starts hate you. No, but this is part of the story, because in a certain way, part of the ideology of the last 20 years was that everything is a win-win game. In a certain way, if you're going to ask about the ideology of globalization, it was the win-win game. It's about trade, it's about this and that, and people became so mistrustful. They're win-win games, but if you don't believe in the win-win games, nothing is a win-win. Because the most important is nobody is winning at the same time. And I do believe this time lag, when I'm saying, listen, I'm going to win now and you're going to win in 10 years, this makes people extremely mistrustful. And this is one thing that I do believe that this relations between economics, politics, foreign policy has changed. When you see the politics, for example, of Biden, it is much more about domestic politics. It's not about economic growth per se. This is the fear that the American social model is collapsing. If you see on foreign policy, and on this, Jake Sullivan was very clear, he said foreign policy for the middle class. So suddenly, if before foreign policy was you are mobilizing your domestic resources to achieve something abroad, now you're trying to mobilize some global resources in order to solve problem at home. And these problems are incredible. And in the American case, it's very interesting because if you see American social system, America is trying basically to attract the best and the brightest on technological level and so on, top universities, and also the less skillful labor, migrants that can go on the very bottom. The problem is, at the end of the day, there is nothing in the middle. And this crisis of the middle is becoming seen everywhere. And to be honest, I do believe the Chinese are starting to have the same problem, because you have a social model in which they have been extremely successful, not simply producing growth, but moving people from the villages to the cities and basically industrialize them. But to be honest, Soviets, in a very kind of a painful way of their own, were also quite successful to have this transition from the rural to the urban. This is where the socialist regimes are overperforming. And then suddenly you have the model in which people are there and they have a totally different expectations. And I'm saying this because this is what is happening. You do not take your society for granted. All the things that worked before does not work anymore. You basically create jobs not because you believe anymore in the competitiveness and efficiency, but because this idea of keeping the social cohesion is becoming the most important and you don't know how to keep it. And I do believe as a result of it, the crisis looks the same, but it is very different. For example, in places like Germany, when migrant comes, they should be trained. They're never basically getting simply the migrants going to the market because they don't believe that this works, unlike in the United States and so on and so on. Listen, it's not easy to train people. On the American side, you basically have this story of incredibly successful technological class which does not believe that they can change society anymore. I was talking to some of this kind of a Silicon Valley people. They believe in the power of technology. They believe that they can go to Mars. They can believe that they can start anew. There is only one thing in which they don't believe, that you can reform human society. So for many of these people, it is easy to be God than to be man. And I do believe this is a much deeper crisis. This is not on the level simply of how the economy works. This is on the level of what kind of society we're living on. And I do believe both politicians and the business and the economists, they don't know anymore exactly what is the society in which we're living. So we're describing a totally new society on the language which we have been describing the societies of yesterday.
Thank you. Just on this politics economics thing, just a comment that that really think about that over the last 250 years of industrial capitalism, politics and the economy have always been interacting and have always really been fused throughout that time. At different times, like we had in the so-called Great Moderation, it seemed everything was economically driven, but politics was still going on or not going on or was dysfunctional or whatever. So I think you should remember the early economists saw themselves as political economists. If you think about classical political economy of Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, they imbibed the sense that it was about political economy and they were critiqued for it, but they saw that relationship. So I think a point that Ivan made earlier, when you're looking at that relationship, it changes over time, but there's always that fusion, that interaction, which has to be taken into account. Okay, we've got only 11, 12 minutes, so I'm going to take as many as I can here and then keep the last 5 minutes for the platform.
Given that all of the challenges, the crises that we're facing both politically and economically, and combined with the fact that our planet is reaching and exceeding many of our environmental boundaries, do you think now's the time to adopt new measures of what constitutes a healthy economy?
Thank you. I'm Claire Cummings from the Centre for Digital Assets and Democracy. I would just like to thank the gentleman earlier for asking about CBDCs. Are they government control? Well, I think the answer is yes, they could be. And I would like to ask the panel if they've read any of the comments from Christine Lagarde at the IMF and some of the politicians in the European Union about CBDCs and the possibility of programmability and a surveilled state. Thank you.
CBCs, central bank currencies, right?
The sanctions on Russia have proved to be a watershed moment for the growth of trading outside the SWIFT, the development of the BRICS, and a new found acknowledgement on the importance of commodities. The West, on the other hand, seems blinded by a political narrative and prints its way in order to navigate each issue and every problem. At what point do you think the West will recognise the benefit of trading to bring about mutual peace and prosperity?
Okay, thank you.
I'd be very interested in the panel's views on whether they think the Western economy, where the pinnacle of which would be the Federal Reserve in the United States, do you think they will ever stop manufacturing crises and look at the world as it is, and that a unipolar world is not in the best interest of humanity? And when I talk about the manufactured crises, I won't mention Israel and Hamas, but it surprises me that Israel took so long to respond, being the most sophisticated, intelligence-led society in the world. But you have the COVID crises, which really was a scam. You have the anthropogenic climate change issue, which science will tell you there is a scam. You have the whole business of the Ukraine war, which has been driven by the Americans. It seems that Ukraine isn't allowed to make peace.
Come to an end, please, with your
Would
question.
you let us have your comments on these, what is obviously manufactured scams?
Sorry, I just wanted to, it seems this question of politics and economics, nobody seems to be thinking about, for instance, in Taiwan. Taiwan is supposed to be, is a manufacturer of microprocessors and so on a massive scale. And none of the politicians seem to be thinking of the effect of allowing that to be taken by the Chinese, who I'm sure the Chinese are thinking along those lines. And it seems as if the politicians seem incapable of seeing it as an economic problem.
Hi, so sorry, I just came into the room here, but I am interested in economics, especially because I know so little about it. I'm more over in the social sciences and philosophy and things like that. But you mentioned that it's become intertwined with politics, particularly in capitalist era. I'm wondering if economics hasn't always been intertwined with power and politics, even back to the Middle Ages.
Of course it is.
Like, because it was very important back then, but land was more the wealth generator back then rather than capital and factories today. But I wonder if you think that economics is the main driver of political decisions, of power plays, or if it's just one part of a vaster spectrum. What do you guys think there? Maybe you've answered it already. I don't know.
No, I mean, a big question, but the point I was making was more in terms of clearly politics and economics, if you want to call it economics, has always been there throughout history, yes. But the specific thing about industrial capitalism is the apparent separation between the two has become more apparent, or has become emphasized, so that people can have a discussion about the economy, they think, to the exclusion of politics. And I think what we're trying to do is show that they need to be brought back together. Okay, that comment, I will take the platform. 1 minute each, or 1.5 minutes each.
I thought there was an interesting mention of BRICS, which we didn't get to, the BRICS countries, and I think that some of the developments that are taking place there, the recent BRICS conference in South Africa, I thought was quite interesting in terms of the reaction that you see in other parts of the world to the fragmentation. And when I was in India last, there was a whole move to do trade with Tanzania all in rupees, just because they don't want to be exposed to the dollar. So I do think that the US economy is dominant, they live off the position of the world dollar, but I do think that the fact that they are literally living off the rest, we are living off the rest of the world, does throw up problems. And I think it's those kind of ways of where we're going to see the challenges, which will be both economic and I think political challenges to the US.
So many questions.
90 seconds.
Politics and economics, it's a false dichotomy. Obviously, people like me are going to say economics. What I'd say is that the political and media class focuses overwhelmingly on politics until suddenly economics comes to the fore in the form of a crisis. Then the whole of the public says, why are you guys so thick? Why can't you manage this stuff? Why didn't you tell us what was going on with the economics? I didn't want to leave this gentleman's excellent question unanswered, and it was over there as well, on measures of growth. Very, very briefly, not all GDP growth is good, right? But no GDP growth is always bad when there's a growing population, because it's all about GDP per head. We can talk about that in a minute if you want. CBDC, again, I didn't want to leave this unanswered. I do believe, and Google me in 2013 when I was first writing about Bitcoin. I do think the financial establishment, the political establishment is worried about a payment system that they don't control. I absolutely believe that, a payment system that they find very, very difficult to tax. I believe that the cashless society, the drive towards that is outrageous, particularly for older people, and we need to protect it at all costs. I'm the guy who, for my sins, launched a campaign on GB News, Don't Kill Cash, which got 350,000 signatures. And finally, on BRICS, I'm, again, constantly amazed how little coverage there is of what's going on in the BRICS. I've been at a lot of BRICS summits myself over the years. China's developing its own version of SWIFT, their own ratings agencies, which a lot of the world's most populous countries take a lot more seriously than the US rating agencies and then SWIFT itself. And in terms of the huge question overshadowing this debate, it's the last thing I'll say, Phil, maybe, is that this whole reserve currency thing, because to be the world's reserve currency is to have the exorbitant privilege and to the best claim to being the unipolar state. And you now have the reality where China, the world's biggest manufacturer, is importing energy from Russia under many definitions, oil and gas combined, the world's biggest energy producer and exporter, by the way, and they trade in a ruble yuan cross. They don't trade in dollars, right? That is absolutely huge development. And since 2014, since Maidan and the West's response to Maidan, we have been driving Russia into China's arms. And where, having lived in Russia and spent a lot of time in China, you know, talk to 4-year-old Russians, right? Which I sometimes do, not in that way. My 3 British kids were all at a Russian school for a few years, and so we learned lots of Russian nursery rhymes. A lot of the nursery rhymes are about, my God, the Chinese are coming to get us. You know, there's a lot of suspicion between these countries, and yet they've never been closer, and they're getting closer still because they have economically aligned interests. Massive energy exporter, massive energy importer, and that drives the politics.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just have to make one point. I very much agree that unilateral world is over, but it has 2 different versions. In the positive one is that the Americans can do anything that they want, and on the negative that they are guilty for everything that is happening. The bad news is that unilateral world shows the limits of the American power. And by the way, also the limits of the Chinese power. We are going to live in a world in which middle powers are going to be much more active. Turkish of this world, India, Indonesia, and Russians also, but particularly Chinese and Americans are going to be just in the business of trying to contain certain developments that they don't like. They don't have the power to shape. Fragmentation is much stronger than polarization. And from this point of view, this world is very different than the old Cold War. And from this point of view, even if Americans wanted to produce all the crises in the world, now, for good or for bad, they don't have a capacity to do it.